Hi, Great Text. Nice to hear from you. Okay, first of all, on the will and the homelessness thing, somebody in comments made the same claim, and I'm not really buying it. Okay, I'll try not to be too defensive about this, but basically, I was talking about activism. Okay, now I'll admit I think there's a role in the question of will for the person who is homeless. I'll talk about it in a second. Okay. But I was talking about activism. I'm talking about you and me and Gary and us thinking about the social problem of people that are involuntarily homeless and how a determinist in our position is inclined to say, well, it's just the way things have to be. Inclined because that is what they are saying. Now, many of them are not really willing to say that because they're compassionate. And they think it's being compassionate to say, oh, it just has to be that way. It's not their fault. Who cares about the fault? I want to stop the problem. I want to cure the problem. And therefore, it's not compassionate to say, well, the problem has to be there, but at least it's not their fault. Okay. Now, as far as being homeless, if it's involuntary homelessness, yes, the will is important. And thinking that your will can play a role is important because, there's a chance that it can, or it's going to have to play some role. But, you know my politics enough to know that I think there's a rigged system, and the system is rigged. So it's the will of all of us together that is the question in social matters, like involuntary homelessness. Okay, so it does relate to that. But it's a cheap trick to try to say that I'm blaming the homeless. On the other hand, I'll take a little bit of that idea that if somebody is involuntarily homeless and they're thinking nothing can be done about it, it's just the way things are, and so they're not trying to use their willpower, then yeah, I would say no, use your willpower. I am saying that. Still not laying blame. I don't think that's a blame, but I'm saying, hey, this is part of the solution. This is giving credit. This is like your willpower is powerful still. Don't give it up any more than you absolutely have to. But obviously, it's not necessarily enough. There's the will of the whole rest of the system that you have to deal with. Now, on the field of consciousness, yeah, I did say that. I want to go with this, this kind of model. I think that there's something in nature, obviously, and I offered two models of emergence rather to consider. There's the magnetic one where the little tiny bits are basically magnetic and it adds up into a magnet that you notice, but it's magnetic the whole time. But there's also the emergence of a phenomena like fire, which is latent until it is expressed. And I think those are two good models to consider, and that will has to be emergent in one or another. Now, I like emergence in the idea of magnetism, that basically there's some sort of navigation of multiple possibilities in the universe that happens on all levels, and on our macroscopic level we can see an alignment in some material objects that reveal this feature, much like magnetic field is. But it could be like fire. It could be like fire in that the little tiny bits don't have this something very much like will until the chain reaction starts. That's even just as likely. I can't even say exactly why I'm leaning towards one or the other, but I'm considering both. And both of them are subject to what you're scoffing at, is that, well, it's not really there until it's there later. No, you can't take an integral over an infinite number of zeros and get anything but zero. Okay, so there has to be an infinitesimal contribution, physical phenomena to will, or for it to, or consciousness, I'll get into that later, those two terms, for it to exist. So it's two types of emergence, and maybe you can talk about why you prefer the fire one, or why it's really even different. I think either way, there's some little element. We know in the chemicals what's latent there, what's the potential energy that can release into it. So what is the potential energy? What's the structure that can be, that burns with in the flame flickers in the color of will and or consciousness. I'm reading Candide because it's easy to read these kind of books on the iPod. I'm reading Candide, and it just, the best of all possible worlds, and how dangerously pacifist that is in a bad way. Okay, the final thing is, I have been, because of the reaction, I do use will and consciousness interchangeably, and they're not literally the same thing because they're different perspectives. But I think that any conscious experience has a certain amount of will. You brought up subconscious will, and so that's my point. I think that when energy goes into a living system like the brain is, there's a reaction which is a willing reaction, and it can be kind of like, I can't do anything, but I sort of have an urge in a direction, but I can't accomplish it, and that's the null state. There isn't really a zero will, and like you say, there's conscious and unconscious. So I do believe the consciousness comes in and out. Now, the main reason I've been just not talking about the distinction between the will and the consciousness is because we've been focusing on will, and the will requires that there's this theater, this consciousness for it to will and reaction to and within, right? And I just think that's a great question, but there's this other question, and you can see Hythloday doesn't get it. There's this other question of where is this first person experience, that there's a difference between me watching somebody else behave in a living or conscious or thinking manner, or any of these living words for organically generated behaviors, and actually feeling like I'm inside something, that I am something that is behaving. There's a difference there. And now I think that they are so intimately related that they're different terms, they're different, like heads and tails, both describing the same coin, right? So they're definitely distinct, but they also, a lot of the questions that relate to one can be easily translated into a question that relates to the other. To make the distinction, will is this idea that you have an intentional reaction. So a choice of reactions, and you're choosing among these envisioned choices, and that's will, and that definitely has a lot of illusion. We both agree, but I guess we both agree that there's some choice remaining if you were to be able to remove all the illusion. Okay, but it definitely has a lot of illusion. But this consciousness thing, while you could say it has illusions, it's a way of asking the question, or setting up the situation where illusions don't count as illusions. In the Cartesian theater, if you're having a hallucination, is it an illusion? Well, it's an illusion if you're assuming that it's more than just on the Cartesian theater, but the Cartesian theater is made of illusions. Some of them might be copies of things that your eyes are seeing, but it's this internal stage. So if you're seeing it, then yep, you're seeing it. It's not an illusion that you're seeing it, that you're having experiences. So we can make that distinction, but of course we have to get into each one of these a little bit more before that distinction is going to be that valuable. So I agree that there's a difference. On the other hand, I can defend that they're the same thing in the sense that they're inseparable, like the north and south pole of a magnet. You can make the distinction, but there is no monopole, so they come together, right? So in that sense, they're united. But of course, it's a useful distinction for us because, it's a distinction between the fact that that there's the observer, and we are an observer, that's created, and we are that, or seem to be that, or that's what we want to call the observer. So, all right. Cheers. Thanks for their feedback.
Let me ask you a question. You never really remember the beginning of a dream, do you? You always wind up right in the middle of what's going on.
I guess, yeah.
So how did we end up here?